Hey everybody, welcome back to an all-new episode of 10 to Life with me, Annie Elise. The case that we're talking about today is a difficult one. It's one that we have talked about in the past briefly. I believe it was on the podcast. It wasn't here on YouTube. But it's one where there was conspiracy, there was allegations of police cover-up. It was in a similar area, which I'll get into the details, is as the Karen Read thing. So people were screaming, there's so much police corruption, there's this, there's that. And anytime we hear about there being a cover-up by a police officer or some sort of corruption taking place, it's not that it's difficult to believe it, because we see that it unfortunately does happen often, but it's almost, at least for me, and tell me how you guys feel, but you're almost reluctant to believe it because it's like you don't want to jump to being a conspiracy theorist right out of the gate. You don't want to think the worst. But in today's case, we now have a police officer who was accused of that, who's been indicted for murder. And the details of this case, it's not even just that, guys. It goes so much deeper. We went through all the documents, all the discovery, the warrant, all this stuff. And it is like, as a mom, as a human, as a female, it's heartbreaking. It is so heartbreaking because here you had this young woman who I believe probably thought that she was in love. She probably thought she was in love, that she was having her fairy tale ending, she was pregnant, all of these things. And it could not have been further from the truth. And there are some similarities and some interconnections with the people who were involved with the Karen Read case as well, which makes you wonder, is that going to now have a brighter light on it? Because when everybody first started talking about this case, which, sorry, I know I haven't said the name yet. Oh my gosh, Sandra Birchmore. So as this Karen Read trial was happening and everybody was talking about that, it brought the Sandra Birchmore case to light a little bit because not many people had heard about it at that point. But then when you had some of these same players involved, people were looking at the two of them and being like, wait, there's something here. There's something interesting. And now there's more information that has come out in Sandra's case. And it's disgusting and heartbreaking. And sorry, I'm not meaning to talk, but I want to give you guys the full rundown of everything that happened because this case is very complex. It wasn't just what everybody's hearing right now of, oh, she was pregnant, this cop staged her taking her own life and he was having an affair with her. It goes almost 10 years deeper with that, specifically his relationship with this girl. So I want to go through the text messages with you, details, their history, all of it, because he's not the only one who needs to be held accountable. There are more people involved in this. So we're about to blow the lid off of everything. Buckle up, guys. Today's going to be an interesting one, a wild one, and an infuriating one. So let's jump right in.
This is 10 to Life with Annie Elise.
On February 2nd, 2021, at a hospital in Newton, Massachusetts, Michelle Farwell, who was a wife to police detective Matt Farwell, gave birth to their third child. This happened at 9:25 a.m. However, 12 hours earlier, 34-year-old Matthew was 2 hours away. He was inside apartment 3307 in the Canton Woods Apartments, and he was visiting Sandra Birchmore, who was just 23 years old. Matthew was seen entering the apartment complex lobby at 9:14 p.m. and then exiting just 29 minutes later. Then, 12 hours later, while Matthew was holding his brand new baby boy, Sandra Birchmore, who was allegedly 3 months pregnant with Matthew's baby, was found dead. Stoughton is a town in Norfolk County, Massachusetts. The population is a little over 29,000 people, and the town is approximately 17 miles from Boston, and it's 31 miles from Providence, Rhode Island. Now, this quiet little town would soon become the center of news articles and Reddit threads for the grooming of minors going on inside their Stoughton Police Department Explorers program. See, the Explorers program is a program within police departments nationwide, which enables young adults to gain hands-on experience for a potential career in law enforcement. It's also a chance to network with employed law enforcement officials and even go on ride-alongs in their squad cars. This program never existed in Stoughton until Robert Devine took over in 2001, and the program blew up, and by 2011, more than 300 kids had gone through this program. The kids loved the program, and most kids even found a home within it, and Robert kind of took on like a fatherly figure role for most of these kids. He gave them a sense of stability that a lot of them had never had before. So in 2013, when 13-year-old Sandra Birchmore entered the program, she was one of those kids looking for stability and a father figure. Sandra was raised by her single mother, Denise Birchmore. However, Sandra's grandmother and aunt also lived with them and helped raise her. Now, Sandra had no relationship with her birth father, and her stepfather died when she was really young. Her mother was also always sick throughout her childhood, but no matter what Sandra's circumstances were, she was always optimistic about her future. Nonetheless, she was yet another highly vulnerable 13-year-old child, and she was entering this Explorers program, looking for something to be involved in, something to just sink her teeth into. And of course, entering this program, she had no reason not to trust these police officers. They're people that we are taught to trust from a very, very young age. However, it was just to find out that not all cops are good cops. Like I said earlier, Robert was the leader and the one responsible for the Explorers program, but he also had help from two other members of the Stoughton Police Department, twin brothers, William and Matthew. Now, prior to joining the department, Matthew and William both served as part of the explosive ordnance team leaders overseas. By 2012, they were both police officers in Stoughton and also active with the Explorers program. They both donated their time as physical and drill instructors, as well as taught the explosive class. They brought in bomb robots, blast jackets, and shields, and honestly, from the sounds of it, they were both very, very good at what they did. And as for Robert, well, at that point, he was at the peak of his professional career after completing his 15th year at the Stoughton Police Department. And in many ways, he was even the public face of the department. The community trusted him. But the community really had no idea what was going on behind closed doors within this Explorers program. They had no idea that these three men were grooming, abusing, and Sandra Birchmore, and also quite possibly doing this to others. But this apparently didn't start with Sandra Birchmore. According to past victims that have come forward, Robert has always been the town creep. Back in 2001, he was a school resource officer. And in a perfect world, someone like a school resource officer should be someone that you really trust, but he ended up being the exact opposite. He allegedly used his power to flirt, to touch, and just get a little too comfortable with vulnerable preteen girls. And there was one specific woman who came forward from his time as a middle school resource officer. She was just 12 years old at the time, and that year her parents were going through a really bad divorce. Now, middle school, we can probably all agree, sucks in general, but add in a divorce to the mix, and it just puts a lot of stress on a child. And Robert became very close with this young girl, often calling her hot and telling her all about the dates that he was going to take her on when she turned 18. I mean, just a creep through and through. He would constantly flirt with her, and he would hang out with her in his squad car. And Robert really abused his power for years and years, and he just got away with it until one day when he didn't. Now, Sandra Birchmore was described as happy, fun, sweet, and loving. However, Sandra had another side to her as well. She was an oversharer, and she would often make people uncomfortable with this. She seemed emotionally stunted through her teenage years and was also pretty immature as well. She struggled to keep friends, and she could often ask too many questions while also offering too much of herself at the same time. She was also very naive and never had proper male role models in her life to look up to. So when Matthew, William, and Robert came into her life, she kind of clinged to them, particularly Matthew. Here it was, these guys in power, in powerful positions, these responsible, educated adults. Why wouldn't you seek their guidance, their attention, right? And they all took advantage of it. So much so that Matthew and Sandra began a sexual relationship when Sandra was just 15 years old and he was 26 years old. And this relationship would carry on through her adult life. In December of 2020, she found out that she was pregnant. She was pregnant with Matthew's baby. She was so excited, and she began telling everybody almost immediately. Now, at the time, she was working as a first-year's teacher's assistant at Sharon Middle School. She told one of her coworkers that she was about 4 or 5 weeks along, and the coworker found it a little bit weird because usually people will wait until they're a little bit further along, and usually only the first people to know are people who are really close or family members. But it seemed like Sandra was just over the moon, and she couldn't keep this excitement to herself. She had even reached out to friends that she hadn't spoken to in years to tell them about this pregnancy. She also told people at her apartment complex who she had only really spoken to a few times before. She was just so excited, and she wanted people to know. However, Matthew, he wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. A few days after Christmas, Sandra had told Matthew that she was pregnant, and they ended up in a pretty heated verbal argument, which led Sandra kicking Matthew out of her apartment. And as Matthew was leaving, he stopped and looked back at Sandra, and he said, "I wish you would kill yourself. I wish you were dead." Now, while the fight was a big one, it didn't make Sandra any less excited for this baby. It was not uncommon for them to have these huge fights and then inevitably reconcile a few days later, so she just began buying things for the baby and preparing to give the baby a good life, no matter who was or wasn't going to be in their lives. Then, on Friday, January 29th, Sandra ran into a coworker in the hallway at work, and being the oversharer that Sandra was, she began to tell her everything. Now, this wasn't a coworker who Sandra really ever talked to. They had opposite teaching schedules, so they rarely saw each other, and really, they barely knew each other. But Sandra told her she was pregnant, and she also told her that she was very stressed out because of issues she was having with her boyfriend. See, Sandra told her how Matthew, her boyfriend, was married. He had other children, and she mentioned that he was a Stoughton police officer. Sandra said that he was very angry about the pregnancy and that he had told her to get rid of the baby because this was not the plan that he had in mind. But she said she was still super excited about the baby. She was overwhelmed but excited. The last thing that Sandra told her coworker was, "If something happens to me, he would be the one responsible." The coworker immediately asked her about a restraining order, but Sandra explained that he was too high up in the police department and he knew too many people, so it wouldn't do any good anyway. It wasn't going to help the situation. So after hearing this huge bombshell and allegation, Sandra's coworker allegedly went to Darren Reynolds, the school principal, so she could tell him all about it and relay the information that she had just learned from Sandra. She told him every single detail that Sandra had shared with her, and she said, "Sandra needs help, and she needs it now." The principal assured her that he would take the appropriate action, and that was the end of the conversation. Now, the conversation happened on a Friday, and that following Monday night, on February 1st, a snowstorm was set to hit. Sandra texted a coworker to ask if she thought that the school would be canceled due to the storm, and even though school didn't end up being canceled the next day, Sandra never showed up, and she didn't show up the day after either. So finally, on the morning of February 4th, Ensley Codard, a patrolman for the Canton Police Department, got a call from the school resource officer. The call was requesting to complete a welfare check on Sandra. Sandra had not shown up to work for the third day in a row now, and when they called her, her phone was going straight to voicemail. The resource officer provided Officer Codard with Sandra's address, and at 11 a.m., 2 officers knocked on her door, announcing that they were there. The officers contacted their sergeant to let them know that nobody was answering, and that's when they were told to try to locate her vehicle in the parking lot. The car was found, and it appeared untouched, and the reason that it appeared untouched was since there had been that snowstorm, it would have been clear if the car had been touched, somebody had tried to gain access to it, and the snow wouldn't have looked untouched. But when they saw it, the snow was certainly untouched. So officers were able to retrieve a copy of Sandra's apartment key from the building management, and they entered her apartment. They immediately noticed that the apartment was completely disheveled, and it was unkept and also had 2 cats running around. When they approached the bedroom door and opened it, there was Sandra. She was on the floor against a door with what appeared to be a lanyard-type rope secured tightly around her neck, which was also secured tightly to the door handle of the bedroom closet. It was very obvious that she was dead, and she had been there for a while because rigor mortis was already setting in, and there was a large pool of dried blood around her mouth. So they immediately called for backup, and after Sandra was pronounced dead, an investigation was launched into her death, with Matthew Doone taking the role as the lead investigator on her case. And ultimately, the medical examiner ruled Sandra's death as suicide with asphyxiation by hanging. When Sandra's friends and family began to learn of her passing, they were absolutely shocked, to say the least. Speculation was running wild that Sandra committed due to her fight with Matthew and him wanting to end things, not wanting the baby. But Sandra's family knew that she would never commit suicide over a fight with Matthew. They felt like she had way too much to look forward to and that suicide just did not make sense because she was so excited to be a mom. The day after Sandra's body was found, the Stoughton Police Chief, Donna McNamara, was contacted by a detective from the Massachusetts State Police because family had reached out to them to inform them of Sandra's relationship with Matthew at this point. Now, none of the family knew that he was in the apartment that night, but they did know that she was pregnant. They knew that she was in a relationship with a married police officer who was not happy about her pregnancy, and now she was dead. So that day, the police chief directed Deputy Chief Brian Holmes to conduct an internal investigation into, quote, the matter of the unattended death of Sandra Birchmore. The investigation report, although heavily redacted, was released 19 months later. And by then, Robert, Matthew, and William had all already resigned from the Stoughton Police Department. The property manager of the apartment complex that Sandra lived in assisted the detectives in going through video footage, and it only showed the front lobby. But they looked through this footage that was prior to the day that she was found dead. And sure enough, on Sunday, January 31st, Sandra was seen multiple times. She left the building at 9:51 a.m. while talking on the phone. She re-entered the building at 10:08 a.m. carrying a large box, which we now know was a car seat. She left again at 10:11 and came back 3 hours later, talking on the phone, this time holding 2 pizza boxes. Then she left again at 4:39 p.m. and returned 2 minutes later texting on her phone. On February 1st, she was seen at 5:46 p.m. holding a snow brush. And that was the last time that Sandra was ever seen alive. The maintenance man and property manager recognized everybody entering and exiting the lobby on the video surveillance that evening, all except one man, who was described as tall, burly, wearing jeans, work boots, a dark hoodie with the hood over his head, and a blue medical mask. He was seen entering the lobby at 9:13 p.m. and then leaving the building at 9:43 p.m. It was later confirmed that this person was in fact Matthew. And this also confirmed that Matthew was the last person to ever see Sandra alive. Now, Matthew was allegedly there to end things with Sandra for good that night. But what's weird about this situation is that we know how Sandra was. She was constantly oversharing, and she was quick to tell people things as soon as they happened. She had even gotten in trouble in the past at work for oversharing details of her life. So if Matthew went over there and broke things off with her for good, you would think that she would text somebody to talk about it, to tell somebody what was going on. But she didn't do that at all. Now, according to detectives, she instead walked into her bedroom, put a lanyard around her neck, sat down on the ground, and hung herself on a closet doorknob, killing not only herself, but also her baby that she was so excited to have. It just was not adding up, and anyone close to Sandra knew that she would never, ever do this. And then come to find out, Darren Reynolds, the principal at the middle school that Sandra worked at, he never contacted the police about that concerning information that was reported to him by Sandra's coworker. So now it really wasn't adding up. When Darren was confronted about why that call was never made, he stated that he didn't even remember having the conversation about Sandra feeling unsafe with any of the staff members, which is not really a type of conversation that you would forget, right? And when the staff members caught wind of that, they were all extremely upset because this was obviously not the truth. When Sandra's coworkers learned of her death, everybody was in shock, and they had staff meetings, and they were even offered counseling. However, as the days went on, nobody ever mentioned Sandra again, not even Principal Reynolds. There was allegedly no follow-up on their mental health, no asking about how they were coping with the unexpected death of one of their own. I mean, nothing. It was almost as if it never even happened, and that they, or Darren Reynolds, just wanted it all to go away. On April 8th, just over 2 months after her death, Robert, the head of that Explorers program, the one who spearheaded the whole thing, was interviewed by a couple of people, by a retired police chief and also a unit detective. And this was part of Stoughton's internal investigation into the death of Sandra. During the interview, Robert, of course, continuously denied that he had any type of relationship or contact with her, and at that point there had been no communication between the two of them ever found, and when he was informed of that, he said, "You won't find it." However, just over a month later, investigators were reviewing the contents of Sandra's laptop when a conversation thread was discovered in her Facebook Messenger. The profile that she was communicating with appeared to be a blocked or anonymous Facebook user. But based on the context of the conversation, they actually quickly learned that the user appeared to be Robert himself. The context led investigators to learn that this person was an attorney as well as a Stoughton police officer, just like Robert was. and there was discussion of meeting in all different locations throughout Stoughton, all while on duty in his patrol car. Now get this, the name of this profile, this Facebook profile, was noted as Marty Riggs, just like that movie Lethal Weapon, where Mel Gibson played a police officer named Martin Riggs. So now we have 47-year-old Robert, head of this program that Sandra was in, using an undercover Facebook account of a fictional character, also he could communicate with Sandra and other minors in his Explorer group. And to make it even worse, sources stated that these messages were so graphic and explicit that they could not even be released to the public. A second interview with Robert was scheduled for mid-August. However, just 3 days before this interview took place, the police chief was notified that he had resigned from his recently demoted position as a patrol officer. His resignation was effective the next day. The resignation letter indicated that he was filing for retirement, and if there were any other further questions or areas to cover within the investigation, they needed to provide it to him in writing. So investigators sent Robert a letter with questions, and a few days later, Robert responded. He stated that he desired to cooperate and suggested that his account was hacked, which internal investigator leaders claimed was absolutely outrageous. Not true. Robert retired about 5 weeks before the findings of the internal investigation was released, and in fact, he collected a full pension of nearly $5,000 a month. He's also still a licensed attorney in the state of Massachusetts. Now, during the investigation, detectives came across 2 letters in his personal file. One of the letters was from April 17th, 2014, and it was from the parent of one of the explorers in his program. In this letter, the police department and Robert in particular are commended and praised for what they were doing for the community. And that letter was from Sandra's mom, Denise Birchmore. Now, at the time that this letter was written, Sandra was 16 years old and at least a year into this sexual relationship with Matthew, another lead adult of this program. Matthew, of course, was also being investigated. And a few days after Sandra's death, he consented to a data extraction from his iPhone. And then a couple of months later, Matthew's work phone from the police department was also turned over and analyzed. There was no communication on either phone. However, they knew that there was some sort of communication because Matthew had stated in a previous interview that he deleted all of his communication with Sandra. So really, they just couldn't find it. It's not that it never happened. The report of the investigation was handed over to the district attorney, and then he put out a statement saying, after state police detectives and the medical examiner found no evidence of foul play in the death of Miss Birchmore, the Norfolk District Attorney's Office referred information developed in the death to the Stoughton Police Department for action. While prosecutors will review any additional information, it should be noted that in light of Miss Birchmore's death at age 23, the investigation to date has not developed a prosecutable statutory case against any individual. So at the end of 2022, Sandra's family filed a lawsuit against Robert, Matthew, and William for her wrongful death, alleging that the officers groomed her from her early teens into her adult life. And the civil suit named Matthew, William, and Robert as defendants in an ongoing scheme of grooming, misconduct, and negligence in a 10-year period of sexual abuse and mistreatment. Sandra's family also sued the police department and the town. The suit claims that the Stoughton internal investigation found that Matthew had known Sandra since she was 13 years old and began having sex with her when she was 15 years old, which definitely would have constituted statutory rape, as the age of consent in Massachusetts is 16 years old. Police released their heavily redacted report on everything, which said that there was insufficient evidence to prove or disprove that Matthew violated any laws, in part because, quote, investigators would need the testimony of Sandra, who is deceased. Both the Stoughton report and the lawsuit said that William and Robert had similar sexual relationships with Sandra as well. Robert has risen to deputy chief before being demoted in 2016 over his allegedly improper handling of anti-harassment orders. He ran the Explorers program, and Matthew and William participated. Robert effectively established the guys as his understudies in using their positions and influence while on duty to engage in inappropriate behaviors with minors and with Sandra. So now all of that background on this case brings us to now. In June of this year, talk about the case began ramping up after Dr. Michael Baden, a former chief medical examiner of New York City, who was hired by Sandra's family, said that Sandra did not die by hanging and that her cause of death was strangulation and the manner of death was homicide. He pointed to the injuries on Sandra, including a fracture to the hyoid bone on her neck, which he stated is very uncommon in self-inflicted hangings. However, it is seen in about half of the homicides by strangulations of women. Now, in response to his claims, the Stoughton police chief released a statement saying, "I was profoundly disturbed and troubled by what I read. While I'm not a trained medical examiner, I am not qualified to draw any direct conclusions. The findings certainly warrant further examination at the highest level. As always, we will continue to assist with any effort to ensure that truth and justice prevail." But then things went quiet. 4 months. That is until August 28, 2024, when news broke that Matthew Farwell had been indicted for Sandra's murder, and he had been taken into custody. Now, the indictment, which was filed the day prior, was released, and it showed that Matthew was charged with 1 count of killing a witness or victim. It went into very great detail about the relationship that Matthew and Sandra had over the years, and it specifically said that Matthew, quote, used his authority and access to groom, sexually, and ultimately sexually assault then 15-year-old Sandra. Matthew continued to assault her in a sexual way after Sandra became an adult, and it continues to say that he continued to engage in an extramarital sexual relationship with Sandra until he killed her on February 1st, 2021. So a press conference that was held by the U.S. Department of Justice just a couple hours after this indictment was announced gave even more details about the motive and even the planning that Matthew had done leading up to the day that he killed Sandra.
Less than 2 weeks before she was found dead, someone called the Stoughton Police Department and disclosed that Matthew Farwell had had a relationship with Sandra Birchmore. And when Mr. Farwell learned about that call, he became visibly angry. Mr. Farwell, it is alleged in these court papers, started to lose his patience, lose his temper, and the 6'4" Mr. Farwell started to be physically violent with 4'10" Sandra Birchmore. And Sandra Birchmore told her friends that Mr. Farwell had pushed her and shoved her and put her in a chokehold. She was scared. And during that same time, Mr. Farwell was allegedly planning Sandra Birchmore's murder. For the first time, he requested a key to her apartment. And she told friends that he was oddly inspecting the apartment and looking at the closet, including the closet that she was found dead in front of. And then it all came to a head on February 1st, 2021. Mr. Farwell went over to her apartment that evening, and he strangled Sandra Birchmore to death. That's the allegation in this case. And he used his knowledge and experience as a law enforcement officer to stage her death to look like a... He allegedly attempted to cover his tracks to literally try and get away with murder. And he almost did, until today.
Now, as he was saying that Sandra had mentioned to her friends that Matthew was hurting her, I kept thinking back to her coworker. Remember that coworker that she told, if something happens to me, he would be the one responsible? And that was the same coworker who did what she thought she needed to do and tell the principal. But then the principal never did anything about that conversation, which is infuriating because had that principal done something with that information, told the authorities, informed somebody, then maybe there would have been some sort of point of intervention in the sense that this wouldn't have happened and maybe Sandra would still be alive. Now, during the press conference, we also learned more about Matthew's arrest and Sandra's last moments.
At approximately 10:45 a.m. this morning, the FBI arrested former Stoughton police officer Matthew Farwell for allegedly taking the life of Sandra Birchmore in order to ensure her silence. The FBI SWAT team took him into custody at a shopping plaza in Revere without incident. Immediately following his arrest, we shared this significant development with Sandra's family. We know it does not ease their pain, but hopefully it answers some of their questions. Simply put, this case is about seeking justice for Sandra, who we believe was killed by Matthew Farwell after he allegedly groomed and sexually when she was just 15 years old, violating her body and her civil rights. It's also about keeping Mr. Farwell from getting away with murder and from harming anyone else. We in law enforcement are entrusted with immense authority because our decisions can have life-changing consequences, both good and bad. To temper that power, we must adhere to the highest of ethical standards. What we believe Officer Matthew Farwell did, as outlined in today's indictment, is depraved and a gross betrayal of his sworn oath and the public's trust. Let me be clear. Matthew Farwell's gun and badge did not grant him authority to violate the Constitution, and it certainly didn't entitle him to sexual before killing her and her unborn baby in an attempt to cover up his alleged crimes. What's also troubling is we believe Matthew Farwell staged Sandra's body and her apartment to make it look like she had died by suicide. In the days that followed, this sworn police officer repeatedly lied to Massachusetts State Police investigators about the nature of their relationship. It's a stark contrast to the sheer excitement and pure joy that Sandra felt when she told Farwell that she was expecting his child, texting him a photo of a poster she had made celebrating the pregnancy. Our investigation also uncovered additional evidence that is inconsistent with someone choosing to die by suicide. In the hours leading up to Sandra's death, she reached out to a photographer to inquire about booking a newborn photo shoot. She also reached out to a friend about obtaining baby clothes. And at the time that she was in the middle of doing laundry when she died, with a load in the washing machine and another one in the dryer.
I'm sorry, but anybody who is thinking of taking their own life is not preparing and getting baby clothing. They are not preparing and scheduling a newborn photo shoot. They're not in the middle of changing their laundry over from the washer to the dryer, which is what was happening when she was killed. And it was mentioned in the press conference. She was living life. She was literally taking steps in her daily life in those hours of moving forward, not thinking of taking her own life. So now, not only did law enforcement release the indictment and then have that press conference, but they also released even more documents. Documents that would reveal things that most people never even expected. And I want to warn you, this gets graphic, disgusting, and outrageous, okay? So to start, as many people would expect, there was plenty of documentation of the conversations that Matthew and Sandra were having over text messages. And when I say plenty, I'm talking along the lines of over 32,000 text messages. Now, a previous document that was released by the Massachusetts State Police shared that when Matthew's phone was examined by law enforcement and then that data was extracted by State Trooper Nicholas Garino, there was no communication that was found between Matthew and Sandra on his personal phone, nor on his work phone. This was after Matthew had said that he deleted the messages between the two of them. Now, coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, this was the same trooper who also couldn't seem to find any of those deleted phone calls that Jen McCabe had made in the Karen Reed case. I mean, seems like a pretty big coincidence, right? Potentially proof of cover-up for multiple law enforcement members and for their families? I don't know. You can be the one to judge that one and form your own opinions. But anyways, it was clear in many of these text messages that Matthew was worried about it getting out that he essentially was grooming and sexually harming Sandra from a very young age. That's based on the fact that he consistently told Sandra to delete all of their messages because those messages were evidence of his misconduct. Now, some of those texts were them talking about the very first time that they ever had sex. And this first set of text messages took place in 2019, although the first time that they had sex was in 2013. But in this text exchange, Sandra told Matthew that she was glad that he got to be the one to take her virginity. To which Matthew responded that it was, quote, a big thing to get to be the first. About a month later, in another text exchange, Matthew asked, what would you have done if we never used a condom and I never pulled out? And Sandra responded that she still would have finished school. In another one in 2020, Sandra says, I had butterflies so bad the day that you took my virginity. Matthew responds, me too, it was such a big day. Sandra says, I still know the date to this day. Matthew says, really? She says, yes. And then he responds with a smiley face. Sandra says, that's not a date I'll ever forget. It was April 10th, 2013. He sends another smiley face. She responds with, best day of my life with a face with the heart emoji. And to that he replies, me too. Which, I just gotta say, if the best day of your life, Matthew, is having sex with a minor who you groomed, you gotta figure out your priorities, my man. Now, in another one, Sandra says, I'm glad you agreed to take my virginity, though. To which Matthew responded, me too. And then later he said, LOL, if I pushed, I absolutely could have fucked you without condoms from day one. Just disgusting, right? Then in another conversation, it reads, Matthew says, I wish we had just done it for real the first time. Sandra replies, I know you do, baby, with a sad face. Matthew says, it would have been perfect. Sandra says, yes. Was it still perfect the first time? And he says, of course it was, baby. She replies with a smiley face. Matthew says, I never thought that you would let me. She replies, I never thought that you would. Matthew says, I wanted it so bad. Sandra, so did I. I knew the day we made eye contact that I wanted you to fuck me. Matthew, you should have told me. We could have fucked so much sooner. Sandra, smiley face. Then Matthew says, clear out that last part in a reference to deleting the text messages. He didn't want the trace of that. He didn't want that on record. So Sandra replies, I did. And then he, in a gross detail, which I freaking hate when people say this, especially men, he responds, good girl. So if you think those text messages were bad, and if your blood is boiling, like mine, I'm seething, just wait until I tell you about the other ones. Because there were lots of text messages where he talked about choking her during sex, other gross things. I mean, one of those text messages from him said that he was going to grab her by the throat and say, shut the fuck up now or I won't pull out. Almost as though like he's getting off on like releasing inside of her, okay? Then in another one, he says, maybe I'll hold you down by your throat while I pound you. Then he asked her how tight he should squeeze. And then he said that he wanted her to feel like, quote, oh my God, this is really happening and I can't stop it. Now, the gist of those, and unfortunately I've seen similar messages in different coverage and different kinks and different fetishes, but the gist of that is that he wants to feel as though she doesn't want him to release inside of her, but that he's holding her down, choking her, forcing her so hard that she has no other option and that she knows it's coming, but that she can't stop it. And that's what he gets off on. It's like a power trip kind of thing. And that's what his fetish is in this. And this is just one of the many. There were also numerous text messages where Matthew and Sandra talked about his disgusting fantasies, particularly where he would act like he was doing things to her involuntarily, if you catch my drift, like sexually attacking her against her will. Also, there were times where they would like talk about role playing in these fantasies where she would act younger than she was at the time, which she was already extremely young. There were even multiple times where he wanted her to act like she was his little sister and he was her older brother and he was sneaking into her room at night to assault her. So you're telling me not only are you grooming this young woman, this young girl, I should say, but you have these interesting and perverse, in my opinion, kinks with this young woman that you're trying to act out about releasing and about holding her down, about her having sex against her will, but now you're also going to throw incest into that, and you want her to role play that she's the younger sister, you're the older brother, and you're sneaking into her room at night. It is so deranged and so disgusting. I can't. And in one message, he talked about how he was going to pin her down, and then he said, quote, will you say, Matt, stop, I'm 13, I'm not ready for this, oh my God, please stop. So the fact that he was doing this with a young woman, that was part of his thrill as well. He wanted her to react and say, no, I'm not ready for this. I'm too young. It is so, I don't even know the word, guys. I'm like getting really, really worked up right now. It is so disgusting and so infuriating. For any human being, it would be disgusting to see these messages and to know that this behavior was going on. This guy was in law enforcement. He was running a group called the Young Explorers Program where he was taking children under his wing and trying to be the safe haven, the guy who was protecting them, the pillar of the community, the police officer, and he's the one. It is just, I need to collect myself for a minute. I'm sorry. It is just such a betrayal on so many levels. So many levels. Now, the thing is, in all of this, deleting those text messages wasn't the only length that Matthew was willing to go to ensure that his dirty little secret didn't get out. In October of 2020, Sandra learned through a friend that Matthew's wife was pregnant. And after learning that, she did two things. One, she drafted a text message to his wife that said, I'm just messaging you to inform you that your husband Matthew has been cheating on you since before you guys were even married. And then two, she gave him an ultimatum. Now, it doesn't seem like she ever sent that text message to Matthew's wife, but the ultimatum that she gave him was that if he would have sex with her with the intention of giving her a baby, then she would not disclose their relationship. So basically, look, I won't blow up your life, I won't blow up your family, but you have to give me a baby, and then I'll stay quiet. And of course, Matthew needed her to be quiet. Not only was he likely to get charged with something over Sandra being a minor when he had first started grooming her and doing things to her and having sex with her, but also he had been meeting up with Sandra while he was on duty. There were times that they even did things together in his patrol car. So essentially, he could be federally charged for a few things, including statutory rape rape while acting under the color of the law, lying about the hours he worked for compensation while he was actually meeting up with Sandra during that time. I mean, you name it. And Matthew really, really, really did not want that. So they made that agreement. He would try to give her a baby, and she would be silent. So she sent him her ovulation schedule, and the two of them began planning. A week later, though, Sandra and Matthew had a disagreement. Apparently, Matthew thought that the agreement was that Sandra and him would try once for a baby, but Sandra thought that it was going to be an ongoing thing. So over the next couple of months, they talked multiple times over text message about this baby thing. Then, on December 28th, Sandra sent Matthew that announcement text, and that included a poster saying, "We are going to be parents." Matthew was not happy about this, not in the slightest. His immediate response was, quote, "I literally have nothing to say right now. How could you express that in a text message when I said I don't appreciate it?" That message was followed up with a text saying, "How far are you?" Sandra replied, "Regardless of how far, we are keeping it. But I'm 3.5 weeks, which means that I conceived this month." Matthew said, "Okay, well, we need to talk then." Sandra said, "No shit, that's obvious. And the birth certificate is being signed, or hers isn't." There were a few more texts in that thread, but essentially Sandra wanted Matthew to be on that birth certificate. But obviously Matthew did not want to be. Now, common sense would tell anyone that that would be a huge risk for him to take, not only professionally, but also personally. I mean, at the time of those messages, his wife was literally 8 months pregnant. But shortly after Sandra told Matthew about her pregnancy, he started allegedly physically harming her, which she ended up disclosing to friends. One friend said that Matthew told Sandra, quote, "That's not my child. I don't want anything to do with you." And then he shoved her to the ground after that. Her therapist also said that Sandra disclosed Matthew shoving her. And it does seem like she was screaming out for help, whether that was subtly or outright to her therapist or her friends. It seemed like she didn't know how to get out of the situation and was likely maybe trauma bonded with him and so manipulated, so groomed that she didn't see a life without him at this point. But despite Matthew clearly not caring about Sandra or the pregnancy, she was determined. She wanted to raise that baby, and she wanted to raise it with Matthew. So she repeatedly brought up that birth certificate. Also, the baby having his last name, just all things baby. But things were about to take a very drastic turn when Matthew learned about his work being called by Sandra's friend. Remember that coworker who told him, "Hey, her friend called, said that you guys have been having sex." That was enough. That made him absolutely enraged. So he reached out to Sandra saying, "Dude, your fucking friend just called my job, Sandra. What the fuck?" And Sandra wrote back with a question mark. He said, "Your friend blank just called my effing work to complain about me. WTF?" Sandra replied, "I don't know." She didn't even say the whole thing. She just put the IDK. And he said, "What do you mean you don't know?" She says, "I literally just woke up." Matthew said, "Did you steal from her?" She writes, "Nope." He responds, "What's going on? You also told me that nobody knew about us, yet she claimed that we are effing." Sandra responded, "It's literally nothing." Matthew says, "It's not nothing. She called my job. That's insane. Why would she call and drop my name, Sandra? Like, what do I have to do with you not giving her something? You have no idea how bad what she did is. I literally can't even believe that this is real life. Like, what else do I have to worry about now? Which other friend will do something tomorrow?" So in these text messages, and this is just my opinion because I can't speak for Sandra, obviously, but she was giving these like one-word answers. It seems as though she was pissed off and maybe even a little bit removed, just being like, "I don't know, not a big deal, question mark, like not my problem," that kind of thing. And it's clear that he was beginning to realize that he could no longer control her and keep her silent. But then it seems like things seemed to calm down a little bit. Well, at least to Sandra they did, because 3 days after that heated exchange, Matthew went over to Sandra's house, and in her words, he did a complete 180. He asked Sandra for a key to her apartment. He said that if she was quiet, he would come around, he would be involved in the baby's life. And this key request for her apartment was a very big deal, because previously he did not want a key to her place. But now he did. And Sandra happily went and made him one the next morning. In text messages to friends, she said that she finally thought that he was coming around. But she had also told multiple friends that he had looked inside her closet and her bathroom and that it was really weird. She didn't know why he was inspecting her apartment, but now I think we can look back and see, hindsight is 20/20 all the time. And he was looking around. He was trying to figure out where things were, the configuration. Maybe he was beginning to plan. He was also trying to pretend that he was happy and that he would come around to keep her close, get a key to her apartment so he could allow himself entry, all of the signs of premeditation. Now, over the next few days, they talked about the baby, and like usual, Sandra was happy and excited. She even asked him if she could share the baby names, but his response was that it needed to be an in-person conversation. Which, as a side note, this needs to be an in-person conversation thing seemed to happen a lot, especially regarding the baby. Probably because he didn't want any sort of digital paper trail, right? And then on February 1st, we know he went back to Sandra's apartment, allegedly killed her, and then left without a care in the world. The documents released give even more information about the crime scene and the aftermath. It says that when the investigators got into the apartment, Sandra's body was seated up on the floor in a reclined position with a duffel bag strap tied around her neck. That strap was connected to her closet doorknob, that same closet that he had been inspecting the week prior. Sandra's phone was also found near her when she was found. And when the phone was analyzed by the FBI, it showed that the screen was last turned off around 9:18 p.m. Now remember, Matthew got to her apartment around 9:14 p.m. Then at 9:40 p.m., the phone picked up somebody taking about 8 steps. Matthew left at 9:43 p.m., meaning that Sandra had to have been dead by then. So were those 8 steps he took to stage the phone? I mean, we know that Sandra was constantly on her phone, so did Matthew think that by having her phone a few inches from her body would look less suspicious? Maybe it would look like she had her phone in her hand and then dropped it as she was dying. Maybe he tried to access it to leave a note in it. Who knows? Sandra also had a necklace that she wore every single day. After her death, her family found that necklace lying on the bedroom floor, right where she was. The necklace chain was broken, but not the clasp. It also had a large clump of hair on it, which clearly to them indicated a struggle. Her family also found that poster and that onesie which said, "We're going to be parents." Which does make me wonder, was Sandra wanting to use that to tell him about the pregnancy, or is it possible that she wanted to have photos taken with it which would blow his cover? I'm not sure. But in any event, a couple of days after Sandra's death, Matthew was interviewed, and in that interview, he said that he and Sandra did have a sexual relationship, but that it had only started in 2020. Also, that he had only had sex with her 2 or 3 times in 2020. Not only that, but he also said that this baby could not have been his, because he and Sandra hadn't had sex in months, not since October to be specific, and she wasn't far enough along that the baby could have been his. Now obviously, all of that was later proven to be untrue. We know that he consented to a search of his phone, but what we also know now is that he used his work phone to make 2 Google searches. One was, can deleted iMessages be recovered by Cellbrite? And number 2, can you revoke consent in Massachusetts? Some pretty loaded searches, right? So it seems like maybe he was worried about this exact thing happening and wanted to figure out if he could get his phone back or if there was any way that law enforcement wouldn't be able to find out. Which at that time, they supposedly didn't find all of those text messages. And it never ceases to amaze me how people will think that by wiping their phone, factory resetting it, we saw it with Stephen Stearns and the Madeline Soto case, that they actually are getting off scot-free. There's technology, people. There is technology and forensic specialists who will extract the data. So know that, Now, another autopsy was more recently done on Sandra's body by somebody named Dr. Smock. And Dr. Smock came to the conclusion that Sandra's death was not consistent with that of a self-inflicted death. He went over the differences between how things would look if she did it to herself versus if it was done to her. But one of the biggest things that he said was that there was, quote, skin missing from the inferior and lateral aspects of her nose that is consistent with abrasions. Also, that these types of injuries are commonly seen in cases of suffocation when the victim moves their nose back and forth in an effort to breathe. He came to the conclusion that the cause of her death was asphyxiation. But one of the saddest parts of these documents is the description of how Matthew abused Sandra. There is one section at the end that states that there were journal entries made by Sandra where she explains that he would sexually assault her if she had bad grades, if she had sex with other people, or if she didn't share her phone location with him, since he needed to know where she was at all times. I mean, talk about ultimate control, that he would punish her in such a physical, sexual way if he didn't know where she was, if she didn't get good grades, if she had sex with other people. Like, it's so sick and twisted. Multiple text messages also showed him asking her about her phone location being turned off. There were also other texts that proved that he would use sex as a way to punish her. One time he even texted her, You would have to take a serious pounding to make me happy. And then he told her, you owe me 3. I'll give you a break and I'll spread them out. Sandra responded, please, not all the same day. Matthew said, no, I'll give you a week so you can feel it. And then as soon as it goes away, you'll get it again so you'll feel it for like an entire month. Sandra said, it's not going to be a fun month. And Matthew said, not for you. Another time they were texting and Sandra asked Matthew what would be perfect for him. What would be absolutely perfect for him? And he said what would be perfect for him is, quote, when you say no and make me take it. Full R word. So when Sandra said that she was open to doing that, he said, it doesn't matter. I'll do whatever I want anyways. Again, just full power, control, and manipulation over this young woman. Now here's where things get even worse. During the search of his phone, the FBI found several memes about necrophilia, almost like he had this obsession with it. Now one meme said, what does a pulse and an orgasm have in common? And then it was followed by, I don't care if they have either. Gross, right? Another one talks about how if you have sex on a waterbed with a corpse, it feels like, quote, they are participating because of the movement. Gross, right? Like, what kind of freak enjoys this? Then another one is a meme where it's glorifying a person who kills and sets somebody who they say nobody will ever miss. Not only that, but there were also memes about strangulation, which is how Sandra died. It's just gross and quite frankly scary. I mean, this guy was a clear predator through and through, not only through his action, but through his searches, the material on his phone, his fetishes, what he did. I mean, the worst of the worst.
Yeah, Colton, there's definitely a sense of relief amongst family members seeing former police officer Matthew Farwell being held responsible for this. But tonight they're also sharing new details about the relationship between Sandra Birchmore and Farwell. They tell me when all of this happened, it wasn't the first time Birchmore had been pregnant.
She spent a lot of time over here, many summers. Used to have the pool in the backyard.
Family members cling to happier memories.
She was hilarious, and she was smart as a whip, too. Oh, my God, she was smart as a whip.
But it's been an emotional roller coaster for those who grew up loving and caring for Sandra Birchmore. For Colin Nee, finding out Wednesday that his second cousin was allegedly murdered by former Stoughton police officer Matthew Farwell came as no surprise.
One of the first things that crossed my mind, it wasn't.
Nee says family knew about Farwell, who Birchmore met through a Police Explorer program. Federal investigators claim Farwell groomed Birchmore and started having sex with her when she was just 15 years old.
A couple years goes by, it slips out that she may or may not be having a relationship with one of the instructors. Family members are a little upset about it.
Colin Nee's wife, Kelly, says Birchmore told her that Farwell was the father of her unborn child.
We just all knew he was the father. She's talked about him for years.
And she claims it wasn't the first time Birchmore was pregnant with his baby.
She had told me she had a miscarriage, and the father was a police officer.
Kelly Nee says Birchmore was first pregnant back in 2019, but lost the child. The second time in 2021, leading up to her death, she was elated.
She was sad that she had the miscarriage, you know. So when she finally got pregnant and everything was going well, right before she passed away, she was just so ecstatic that she was finally going to be a mother.
With Farwell in custody, the family now left feeling vindicated for the first time.
Just so happy that the truth has finally come to light and that the FBI stepped in and did what they needed to do. And everyone involved is going to get their due justice.
So as of now, after his arrest, Matthew is sitting in jail. Those documents that the U.S. Attorney's Office released are from a motion for detention. So basically, they laid out all of the evidence, and they did that to show why he should not be granted any sort of bond. It's clear that he is a danger to the public, so he needs to stay behind bars.
I want to bring in two people who've been following this case very closely. They really worked hard to keep the spotlight on this story when it didn't seem like law enforcement was doing that. Maybe it didn't seem like it, but today we learned they have been working for well over a year. Melissa Berry is the founder and administrator of the Justice for Sandra Birchmore Facebook page, and Robert D'Amico is a retired FBI special agent and founder of Sierra One Consulting. Welcome to both of you. Melissa, I just want to get your reaction. your reaction and also sort of the collective reaction from the Facebook group that has really been driving hard to get justice for Sandra?
I'm full of all kinds of different emotions. I'm happy, I'm sad. I'm grateful that the FBI finally got him and got him off the streets. There's been an overflow of thank yous and people coming to the page saying how thankful for the work that we've done there to keep her name out there. And like I said, it's just been a whirlwind of emotions today for everybody. And we were all shocked, but we all saw it coming too.
Robert, it's interesting how we watched the feds come in and basically rescue this whole sordid story. And when they announced the murder charge, it was the murder of a witness or a victim. And I wondered if there's something specific to that to bring it into the federal jurisdiction, because what's the difference between murdering a witness or a victim? It's murder of a person. Why did they have to be specific about witness or victim?
Well, because that's a state charge. Murder of a person is a state charge. But when you get into murder of a witness or a victim, there's a federal statute about that. So that's what they can investigate and that's what they can charge with. I'm sure a state case, because we're sharing information or FBI sharing information, that you're going to come up with a state murder charge. But in the federal courts, there's not that. So you have to go with what, section allows for a murder of a victim or a witness. And they'll tie that back to a victim of this that was conducted on her earlier that I'm sure they have evidence on.
Melissa, when the law enforcement agents who conducted the news conference today said that someone, I believe it was a friend of Sandra's, had called into the police department to report the perpetrator, the alleged perpetrator in this story, that maybe it wasn't taken seriously. Were you surprised to hear that today? Had you heard rumored that there'd been this phone call made to the police department about Sandra Birchmore's, at the time boyfriend, but now alleged killer?
I had heard about an actual different phone call where a friend was looking for money and Sandra wasn't paying her back. So she called the police station and tried to report that. And she said, well, if she's not going to give me my money back, if you can't help me, tell Matthew Farwell that his girlfriend owes me money. And that's the story. I believe that's in one of the reports. And I don't know if there was another situation where another friend called, but I do know about that situation.
So, Robert, knowing that, it makes me wonder if this was ignored. If it was just one of those things where it's a small police department, this is one of their own, because it would seem to me that that would be such a red flag that it would be jumped on right away, and yet it didn't seem to be jumped on right away.
I think there's more than just ignored. I think it got back to him, and he got even angrier about it. And I think that's what ended up leading to him killing her. Because I think, as they talked about in the indictment and the press conference, that he was getting angrier and angrier about the phone calls, about doctor's appointments and the birth certificate. And then all of a sudden he starts getting wind that someone called in. And I did hear about this call, called in and said basically that, she was pregnant with a detective's baby. And when it got back to him, and it's a small department, and they're not used to not sharing that, he found out that it got called in. And I think that's probably when I think you can start looking at the timing of when he asked for the key, when he went over to look at the apartment, was probably basically just after that phone call, I think, the police part. I think that's when he realized he had to do something about this situation before it got worse.
But I think many people are wondering why it took so long to get this done. Why did it take the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office getting involved? How did those phone records not show communication between Matthew and Sandra when they were first analyzed, yet they did show the communication, 35,000 text messages, when the FBI was looking into it? Was this a case of complete cover-up for a corrupt law enforcement officer? Are there similarities that you see between this case and Karen Reed? Or do you think that this was just an oversight? and that now, luckily, her family kept pushing to get things reevaluated, and now there is some forward movement in her case. I don't know. I don't want to get too conspiracy, and once I get some concrete information, I will share it, because right now I need to vet it a little bit more, because there seems to be some overlap in the people involved in not only the Karen Reed case and John O'Keefe's murder, but also in the initial investigation when Sandra first was found dead. I don't want to name those people here yet, because again, I just need to vet one or two more things just to make sure it is completely ironclad. But if it is the case, and it seems like it is the case, that gives me a lot of pause, but it also gives me hope that maybe the Karen Reed thing will be looked at closer before she goes to retrial. I don't know. What do you guys think about this case? I am just so extremely happy that her family finally has answers, and that this monster is off the streets, that he's being held accountable. It's disgusting what he put her through. And like I said at the beginning of this episode, what breaks my heart the most is that Sandra had been groomed by this guy since she was 15 years old. She was now in her early 20s and in what you could describe as a consensual relationship, although I could argue that, because I think when you're groomed to such a degree, there's no consensual nature about it, no matter what the age is afterwards. But she believed that they were in love. She believed she loved this guy. She believed she was going to have a baby, have a family, and all these things. Meanwhile, this guy is using her, abusing her, throwing her away, and literally planning how he is going to kill not only her, but his child too, just so that he doesn't get caught. How many more victims would he have had he not been caught? How many more victims are there that we don't know about that he was doing this? I can guarantee you Sandra wasn't probably the only one. And I'm not talking about murder. I'm just talking about the grooming aspect of it. I am sure that she was not the only one. So what else are we going to find out about this creep? I will keep you updated. I am going to be following this one like glue, guys. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because we are going to talk about this every time there are updates. This is one that I feel very, very passionate about. I want her family getting justice. I want this scumbag held accountable. This poor girl who was failed by so many trusted professionals. It is unacceptable and disgusting. So I will keep you updated. I got to go have a drink of water or something. I'm getting worked up again. Thank you for tuning in and hearing Sandra's story today, and I will be back with you very soon. Until the next one, please stay safe.